there's obviously a long history of thinking about space-time and architecture, and in particular, the idea that a city without movement, like a shark without movement, dies, obviously. You have to have movement in a city. So there's that sense of which, how much movement, what sort of movement, is that a movement that encourages the slowing of movement, the dwelling of movement, or not, is one of the major questions for the modern city, which has so often overemphasized speed and rapidity of movement over experience of the urban environment. So you would contrast, as it were, the ludicrous work of city planners in some cities in South America, where a huge eight-lane highway is passed through the middle of a city, which is uncrossable, creating, therefore, the slums on one side and the rich on the other. And there'll be one bridge to cross, which is controlled as the maids go from the slums to the houses. And you find that in order to create urban movement by cars, you crush social movement. And then you've got the contrast to that. You would have something like an Italian city where a square is somewhere where you either pass through or you stop. And you think of the space as something that can be done in both ways. So there's obviously, in the history of the modern city, in the transition from the smaller city to the larger city, in the question of scale, there is, and many architects and planners have written about this, that question between moving and ending. But it seemed to me that in neither of those questions, although they're focused on experience, is the issue of beauty, which you put at stake. And so the question might be that I was trying to ask really is that if we're committed at some level in modernity to an aesthetics of the moment, something that, as you know, as well as anybody, has a deep religious background in its opposition to the eternity of religious promise, and saying, no, it's not about eternity, it's about now, it's about this second. What does that actually mean if you try and physicalize that beauty? Now, everybody has had the experience of turning a corner and going, wow, that's blown my mind, that's so beautiful. But can that ever be planned for? Can that ever be part of planning? Well, I understand what Richard Sennett talks about when he talks about the allowance for encounter, the allowance for change, that the most damaging form of architecture is architecture that doesn't understand it's going to change, which is the damage of the smart city that says, no, we're smart enough now, thank you. We're never going to get any smarter, or your smartness now is right. Or the concrete blocks where nobody can personalize space. The effects of psychology on that can be absolutely damaging. So we can imagine an architecture that might want to talk about its own transformability as a contrast to eternity. But can it ever imagine, when it talks about beauty, including the aesthetics of the surprise, which is so crucial to modern aesthetics, that idea that the moment is there? Well, you know, I'm looking at architects, they'll have to tell me whether that's part of, I'm trying to tease out what it seems to me to be a paradox of the commitment to aesthetics of beauty and modernity and modern architecture, between that idea of permanence and that sense that, can you create the moment of wonder in a place where you're meant to live, which is the opposite, which is dwelling. It's not a moment, it's not an epiphany, it's not grace, it can be very beautiful, but it's never going to be a moment of wonder in the same way, which requires surprise.